So in this segment, we're going to be talking about Leo Varadkar saying perhaps the protocol is too strict. So Varadkar would have played a key part in the negotiations of the Northern Ireland Protocol, given that he was the Irish executive, the equivalent of a prime minister or president at the time. So the then Irish Prime Minister Varadkar had said some mistakes were made on all sides in the handling of Brexit, vowing to be flexible and reasonable when attempting to solve issues with the Northern Ireland Protocol. So his statements in this specific, when he's talking, is very interesting. So this is something he and others have said for a while now, including Maros Sefcovic, that a compromise can be found. So they are appearing to be reasonable, trying to balance the UK and unionist concerns, but also trying to protect their single market, which of course is the most important thing here for them. One thing he says, quote, "One thing I have said in the past is that when we designed the protocol, when it was originally negotiated, perhaps it was a little bit too strict," end quote, the Taoiseach told reporters at a briefing in Dublin. I think he has said this before. From the EU perspective, they were always wary of the UK deregulating and importing food from countries with lower standards than the EU, which would potentially open up the single market for said lower standard food. So having a strict protocol makes sense. It's easier to make the rules easier or more lax rather than stricter. Could you imagine if the protocol was not strict enough and the EU asked for tougher rules? That would have been fun to see. So pressure is mounting for an outline of a deal before the 19th of January, the deadline set by the UK's Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, to call fresh elections for the Northern Ireland's devolved government. So this article from a few days ago is recorded on the 11th. They're not going to get an outline by the 19th. Based on what I've seen from Tony Connolly and Lisa O'Carroll, it does not look like an agreement will be reached by the anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, which is something Sunak promised old man Biden. Looks like we'll miss the target before the next Stormont election too, so another deadlock. So if you look at here from Lisa O'Carroll saying EU diplomats have been briefing this for some time, the April the 10th Good Friday Agreement 25th anniversary, not seen as a hard deadline, but I think the UK have kind of set it as somewhat of a hard deadline. If it takes a bit longer, that's fine, they say. Immediate pressure point is to make sufficient progress on an outline of the deal by the 19th of January before the calling of another Stormont election. So even Tony Connolly saying that, definitive deal on the Northern Ireland Protocol might not be reached by the 10th of April according to sources. And these two specific journalists have, top sources regarding this sort of stuff. In a significant remark, Varadkar conceded that the protocol, which has never been implemented fully after the Brexit Minister Frost abandoned checks on goods, including fresh food, at Northern Irish ports, was not causing the problems the EU had envisioned. Quote, we've seen that the protocol has worked without it being fully enforced, and that's why I think there is room for flexibility and room for changes, and we are open to that and open up for that. And I know, speaking to the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Vice President Sefcovic, that their position is too, end quote. This again is pretty interesting. Frost unilaterally extended the allowance of chilled meats, which is something the EU don't allow from third countries. And as far as I'm aware, that export of chilled meats from GB to NI is still happening. It has to be fresh or frozen, the meat or sausages or whatever you're moving. I think the EU fear around substandard food has subsided a bit. But this is before the UK-Australia deal has kicked in, and before mass deregulation, which could still happen. Let's not forget the EU Retainment Bill, or whatever it's called, is being passed this year by the looks of it, and that's something we'll talk about in a few days. That'll be the real test of the protocol, stopping substandard food being moved from GB to NI. But for now, the EU seem happy with the effectiveness of the protocol to the point where they will make it easier for goods to go from GB and NI. And they have got a deal, they have got the data around the live movement of goods between GB and NI, so they can actually see in real time, what's being moved around, so they can stop, dodgy shipments of things, which they've had a lot of luck doing, moving, products and other things that, they don't want in the single market. DUP leader Donaldson welcomed the admission from Varadkar that mistakes were made, adding that, quote, it was a mistake from its authors, end quote, which also included Boris Johnson to, quote, press ahead with the agreement, end quote. Quote, whilst Varadkar's comments indicate he now recognises the political reality in Northern Ireland, we need to see a fundamental change of attitude in the negotiations if we are to see an outcome that's durable, end quote, he said. So that's Donaldson. The DUP have said they want an effective end to the protocol, so for Donny to ask for an attitude change makes no sense because he wants a lot more than that. I don't think he'll be very happy until the protocol is gone. I don't know what that means for Stormont given the nature of cross-community consent. Now, Varadkar goes on to say, I've spoken to a lot of people who come from a unionist background in Northern Ireland over the years. I do understand how they feel about the protocol. They feel that it diminishes their place in the union, that it creates barriers between Britain and Northern Ireland that didn't exist before, and I do understand that, I do get it, end quote. And I have to once again mention that even some EU countries have internal borders. That does not diminish the place of those areas within the countries they're in. Most of this is based on the fear that Northern Ireland is pushed towards unification with Ireland. You can make that argument, but you can also argue that Northern Ireland is in a unique position of exporting to both GB and the EU single market with no checks. That's something Ireland can't do, and is an argument that would work, that Northern Ireland, if it was politically stable, would be in one of the strongest positions of any country, really, when you think about it. He said that, quote, so this is Varadkar, but that's also true of Brexit. Brexit was imposed on Northern Ireland without cross-community consent, and he said a lot of people who are unionists feel that the protocol separated them from Great Britain. He then reiterated that it affects both communities in Northern Ireland. Quote, a lot of people from a nationalist background in Northern Ireland feel that it separated them from the rest of Ireland. End quote. I have not heard this argument before from nationalists. Northern Ireland would have closer rules to the EU on goods because both are part of the EU single market for goods but not necessarily services. So you can make that kind of argument even though different countries have different EU members have different rules around things like services. Remember, the EU set the minimum standard. But this could be based around maybe if EU directives have to be implemented in Northern Ireland, like the one on clean water. It's an odd argument. I hope we get to kind of hear more, a better explanation in the future. But he's right, there was no cross-community consent for Brexit. So to argue we needed cross-community consent for the protocol does not really make sense. Even one of the chief negotiators, I think, of the Good Friday Agreement, or one of the civil servants, he was there. He was saying that the Northern Ireland Protocol does not need cross-community consent because it's an international agreement between the United Kingdom and the European Union. So you don't need cross-community consent for that because it goes well above it. Otherwise, you would need cross-community consent for a lot of international agreements. Where was the cross-community consent for the UK-Australia deal, for example? Things like that, really. But, I see his point. I think it makes sense in the context of where we are now, which is in terms of further talks around areas where maybe more, compromise could be found around the protocol. So I get why he's saying this. He's trying to say that, the landing zone is still there, we can still get an agreement, because Sunak's actions have been very different to Boris Johnson's or even his predecessor Liz Truss's. So Sunak very different to the last two. So maybe we can get an agreement and finally put the Northern Ireland Protocol issue to bed here. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.